Welcome to the Stanford Computational Antitrust podcast. My name is Thibaut Schrepel. I am an associate professor of law at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center.
And my name is Theodora Groza, and I am a PhD student at Sciences Po Paris. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Computational Antitrust Podcast 2.0. So far, as our listeners know, we were dedicating our podcast to inviting our authors to discuss their publications. But then Thibaut and I realized that one of the key assets of our project is the fantastic network we have built comprising heads of agencies and scholars as well. And then we decided that from now on, each month we'll invite either a head of agency or a top-tier academic to discuss with us topical antitrust issues and, of course, how computational tools can help us tackle them. And to kick off our new podcast series, we have a very special guest. And on that note, Thibaut, why don't you tell us a bit about who is our first guest and why we decided to invite precisely this person?
Yeah, of course. So, I'll give him the same introduction that I gave during our annual conference back in December 2023. What I said is that it is more likely that an antitrust expert will not be aware of him than it is to find a human being who never tasted water. That person being Bill Kovacic. So Bill, as you know, is the former chair of the FTC, a board member of the CMA, one of the world's most acclaimed scholar and speakers, as you will hear in today's episodes. Now, the reason why we decided to invite Bill is that, first of all, Bill is part of our advisory board and has been for now quite a couple of years. But more specifically, there are three reasons why we thought that Bill would make the perfect first guest for this new format of the podcast. So the first reason is that Bill, as most of you will be aware of, has been instrumental, to say the least, in shaping antitrust policy, not only in the United States, but also around the world, right? So he has worked extensively with advising and helping develop competition policy, antitrust programs in countries from some places in Eastern Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, of course, in the United States as well. So we thought for that reason that Bill will make a perfect guest, having a global view of antitrust and still being on the look for what's happening here amongst all of the agencies. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, Bill has been a long-time advocate for enhancing institutional competencies within competition agencies. He has worked and written quite extensively on the subject, whether it is about the importance of agency performances, capacity building, development of strategic plan, as you will hear in today's episode. He has been involved quite a lot in modernization of the CMA. Reason number three, Bill is a true scholar with a keen interest in interdisciplinarity. Bill brings many of those expertise, being economics, public policy, knowledge of institutions. And so for that reason, we thought that considering the fact that we do need this blending of expertise and approaches for computational antitrust to indeed be deployed over the world and to slowly gain traction. Again, we were very excited to invite him, and I will now leave you the floor, Theodora, for a short summary of the discussion.
So those are very compelling reasons to have our listeners stay tuned in, but to give them a bit more to hold on to just before they listen to the discussion, let me just give them a brief summary of what we'll talk about. So we'll discuss, amongst others, about how agencies should operate with their internal data, what reforms are needed to make computational tools effective, how computational tools can be used to build an effective antitrust enforcement architecture globally, and also how they could, and to what extent they could, provide an alternative to regulation. And on top of all this, we'll talk a lot about sports cars, doctors, frictions, and many other exciting things. So I think it's very compelling to stay tuned in. And on that note, Thibaut, I'll hand it over to you to shoot the first question, because I think that Bill has joined us already.
So, yeah, Bill, first of all, welcome, and always a pleasure to see you. I'll start with a first obvious questions based on what you discussed during our annual conference back in December. So a lot of what we've heard is that computational antitrust can help agencies being more proactive which they need in a context where you see less leniency applications and less reactive methods being efficient. And so for those agencies to be more proactive, what it means is that, of course, they can better detect potential practices, better analyze those practices, better monitor the remedies they impose on companies, and so on and so forth. But before that, it can help agencies to also evaluate a lot of what they've done in the past, right? So in a sense, to take a step back and reflect on their policies, their failures, their successes, and so on and so forth. So now again, coming back to our conference, you spoke about big data antitrust and the idea that competition agencies should first look at the data they have, meaning the data about what they've done instead of the data on the market. And so the question is the following: which kind of data do you have in mind, and where should they start?
First, I'm enormously grateful for the opportunity to do the podcast. Thank you so much for having me part of the series. If we look in the annals of business administration or public administration, the literature again and again emphasizes the importance to good performance of learning from experience. That agencies that progress most effectively over time tend to be agencies that learn well from what they've done in the past, both to replicate success, to understand the sources of failure, and to commit themselves to doing it better the next time. This intuition, I think, certainly applies to the behavior of competition authorities, both individually and as a group. They do collect over time big data. The older the authority, the bigger base of data that it has. And what kind of data is useful? It's data about simply what type of program you have carried out over time, which kinds of cases have you brought, which companies have you focused on, what were your assumptions about how your intervention would change economic performance? Do you have any way of tracing whether those assumptions were borne out in practice? How has your program, generally speaking, evolved? And what can you observe from patterns of activity? So the examination of an agency's experience base and its ability to join up its own experience with the experience of others to create a pool of observations can be an enormous advantage to an agency. I'll give one example that stands out for me. The basic example of public procurement and collusion. Cartels are a horrible affliction for public procurement programs universally. In well-developed economies and those that are still in a process of transition. There's an enormous amount of data that agencies have accumulated and the public procurement authorities have accumulated about who participates in cartels, how are cartels formed, how did the imposition of sanctions affect future participation in the marketplace, what effect did intervention in specific procurement markets have on performance and the quality and price of goods and services delivered. In formulating a cartel program going ahead, that kind of information can be enormously valuable in deciding how to go about detecting collusive schemes, how to punish them, and very important, how to ensure that they don't happen again by getting a better understanding of how they were put together in the first place. So when I think of big antitrust data, I think of this pool of information, which, if used effectively, can make individual agencies and the community of agencies much more effective at what they do.
Yeah, which naturally brings us to your experience working within competition agencies. So, Theodora?
Yes, exactly. So building on your experience at the FTC and the CMA, what do you think are the institutional reforms which are needed to implement computational tools effectively?
One important reform is to build a team of analytics specialists who can do the work. And in this respect, the Competition and Markets Authority leads the field. They made a conscious decision in the previous decade to build an analytics team that could do the kind of work that the computational antitrust program has emphasized. They realized that the team could not simply consist of lawyers, wonderful as lawyers are. that it couldn't merely be economists, though having people with great quantitative skills was important. It had to include technologists. It had to include those with special experience in analytics. And that if you built a dedicated team with those capabilities, you'd be in a much better position to understand what's going on in the broad field of big tech, but also to understand how to analyze and evaluate data in a way that would make the agency's decisions much better informed. The team at CMA, which goes under the acronym DATA, the data team, has over 50 employees now. So that's an investment of 50 in an analytics group that can provide support across the agency. That is the gold standard. I admire it because it required a willingness to make a major investment in capability before it led to a single new case or improved a single project. So you had to make a big investment up front. You needed the right people to run the shop, people who could go to the lawyers and say, tell me about what you do. And I think I can offer some suggestions about how you can do it more effectively, and we're willing to help. That long-term investment I saw as a distinctive feature of the CMA culture, and I'm gradually seeing other agencies, including the Federal Trade Commission, take that on. The CMA had a wonderful event in 2023 where they brought together enforcement agencies, principally for the purpose of saying, here's what we're doing with our data team. The data team described its operation. It described the application to individual matters such as merger control, cartel enforcement. And I was part of the program, but I mainly sat in the audience and watched. I went to the side events where people discussed what they were doing. Even the most hard-bitten and cynical, experienced person from the older agencies walked out of there and said, in effect, wow, we need one of those. It's as though you lived in a neighborhood and you saw the most attractive sports car you've ever seen drive through and park and think to yourself, I've got to get one of those. I have to trade in my humble little sedan for one of those. So it had a powerful effect, and I think it still resonates throughout the community. And it fits very well, to my mind, with the orientation of the computational antitrust program.
For sure it does, and we both agree that the CMA's data unit makes it very special. But on that note, I'm sure there are other things that make the CMA special, and I will let Thibaut push you a bit further on this.
Yeah, and again, working with the sports car analogy, you may especially be in need of that car if you realize that all the companies you are trying to catch are using much faster cars than yours, right? So this may drive the need for you to indeed acquire one of those.
There's a wonderful line, Thibaut, in The Big Short, the movie, where they mention that not having a capability is the equivalent of trying to win the Indianapolis 500 motor race riding an ostrich. So you need a real race car to play in the race. Yeah,
indeed. So, and it seems, and this is a lot of what we hear discussing with agencies and what you just explained, that most agencies, if not all of them, are convinced of what they could do, right, with computational tools. Now, they may have political struggle, the reason why they may not increase the budget and acquire the expertise, but it seems that we are past this point where we need to explain why this could be helpful to implementation. And again, coming back to your experience at the FTC and the CMA, I'm wondering what are, for those two agencies specifically, some of the cultural differences that you may have seen that may, in practice, affect the deployment of computational tools, the use of computational tools. So, what have you learned from your experience there?
And there are obstacles of exactly the kind you mentioned, Thibaut, that impede the deployment of the new capability or the investment in it. I think one of the most effective ways to overcome skepticism is to have the vivid demonstration of how someone else has done it and done it to good effect. That is the very practical example that shows the before and after picture for an individual agency, and not only lays out the very specific practical exercise, but demonstrates how it can be done without backbreaking cost, and can be done either by an individual agency or in conjunction with another agency. Part of that explanation also involves, I think, an honest discussion of how, for the first movers, how the capability was developed. Because when the CMA made the investment in the data team, there was at least questioning about the wisdom of making the major investment in this, what I'll call R&D capability, when there were so many pressures to bring the next case and to roll out the next study. That it's the difficulty of deciding whether to consume in the form of doing new cases or invest in building the capability to do it. So the CMA has, I think, a very good story about how it decided to do this. I'm convinced that one thing that was valuable was the governance mechanism at the CMA. The board at the CMA includes not simply insiders, the so-called executives, but outsiders, non-executive directors. Many of those non-executive directors over time, in my experience, my 9 years on the board as a NED, came from business backgrounds, had held positions on public and private boards outside of the CMA, and they had seen how investments in capability, generally speaking, can generate very positive returns in the future. And the people with the business experience in particular were able to drive home within the board the importance of developing good analytic skills and how the effective use of data could put the CMA in a better position to work well. So I think for agencies that have a multi-member board, it's very useful to diversify the backgrounds of the board to get a new perspective. That's one thing that increases the absorption of a new approach. If you have a single member governance structure, I think it can be very valuable to have an advisory body that offers you a perspective on what could be done a bit differently. Another way to do it is to have a periodic, maybe it's too formal a term, audit by expert outsiders who come in. It requires a great deal of honesty. That is it's like going to your doctor. If you tell your doctor you feel good, how are you doing? It's great. How's your exercise routine? I'm running 10 miles a day. Then why are you 50 pounds overweight? You requires honesty. Your doctor, your physician is not going to be able to help you unless you're candid about your life's routine and about what's not working well. So doing the kind of internal assessment requires a degree of self-confidence and honesty, but I am convinced that the governance mechanism of the CMA, diversification of expertise, diversification of backgrounds, experience in a world where staying at the edge of new developments in analytics were seen as really important. These were all observers who can say, if you are going to work in highly dynamic market environments, you have to have some of the same analytical capabilities that the firms themselves do. Otherwise, you will be bewildered in the face of what goes on. And I'll just mention that the one vivid example of how this was applied that the CMA used came out of COVID, where COVID suddenly turns the world upside down. And one question for the CMA is, well, where are the problems? The CMA started getting a downpour of complaints. The analytics people were crucial in taking the simple step of saying, here's how you organize the flow of complaints. Here's how we code them. Here's how we classify them. Here's how we report them. And here are the weekly results of the complaints we're getting. The CMA, more than any other public agency within the United Kingdom, had a clear and informative perspective of the kinds of complaints that were coming from individual citizens about fraudulent schemes, about access to government services. The CMA was able to say, we can generate this for you because we have a team inside who can do this kind of work. So it was a nice, useful, vivid example of how it could work. And immediately during COVID, the CMA's stature, I think, ascended within the government because it became a resource for public agencies right away to analyze trends in real time because they had the analytics capability to do it.
So we need another COVID. Okay, no, just joking.
Sometimes the external shock provides the inspiration to do things a bit differently.
Exactly, especially in a complex system.
Yes.
So we talked a lot about the FTC, the CMA, and now I want to take us to a completely different space, which happens to be the place where I come from. So this is a very important question for me. And Bill, so in the early 2000s, you published an article about the reforms which were needed to transplant antitrust laws in the new market economies. And you talk a lot about how solid legal reforms were needed, property rights, contract laws, and so on. Now, if we fast forward to today, do you think using computational tools could actually make it easier, faster, more efficient to develop antitrust architectures in new economies?
I do. My physician colleagues, including David Hyman, a frequent co-author. David is a medical doctor as well as a lawyer. And when I use terms like transplant, David always cautions me to say, do you realize the amount of diagnosis and analysis that goes into a transplant? It's not a matter of simply pulling a kidney off the shelf and saying, here. He said there's enormous amount of preparation that goes into establishing the initial condition of the potential recipient, to examining the recipient's condition, to make sure you have a good match, and to structure not only the what goes on in the operating theater, but post-operative care. I think here again, good analytics can give us a better idea of when specific reforms are likely to be most effective, how they can be applied most effectively, what should be the priorities for a relatively new system and getting started. I come back again to procurement as a valuable initial focal point because of its broad economic significance, its enormous significance for distribution and equity. More than any other area of attention, I think you can touch all of the boxes on goals with procurement matters, perhaps more than any other. I think that a more detailed the better assembly of data and analysis of the data puts you in a better position to understand how you're going to adapt the existing legal regime to a new set of commands, how you should implement them, and then once you have a mechanism in place, what you should do with it. And there's a huge body of experience now, as you know, Theodora. It's in 1990 there were 30 countries, roughly speaking, that had a competition law. That number exceeds 140 now, and some of those are ineffective. Some of them are in name only, but there's a significant body of them that have a considerable amount of experience, not just with actual policy implementation, but with institutional design, and building a better body of data that looks at how they progressed from their initial design to their current state of affairs, to identify what affected the possibilities for reform, how they went about getting upgrades when they needed them. That's partly qualitative know-how, but some of it can be measured in a more specific quantitative way. If you're doing a new one, or if you're in the life cycle of evolution, I'd like to know how others have taken the journey before I decide how I'm going to travel myself.
A lot of what you talked about relates to the priorities or the goal, meaning what you are trying to achieve. You also mentioned quite a few times the word honesty, which reminds me of that great song, the lyrics being, honesty is such a lonely word, right? So if we are trying to be indeed honest about what we try to achieve running a competition agency, that leads to very different use cases of what you may want to do with computational tools, right? So if you are trying to protect consumers, it's different kind of tools that you may need, or at least the deployment needs to be different than if you try to protect citizens, democracy, so on and so forth. My question then is this: do you think there is a chance that with the deployment of computational antitrust, we can reach a competition policy that is sound as opposed to a competition policy that is based almost entirely on ideology, whether it is the Chicago school, Harvard school divide, or more recent ideologies that we've been talking about for such a long time?
I think a contribution of computational antitrust is to press the advocate of any goal structure to not only define the goals, but to begin to address the question of how we will know that any specific goal is being attained. That is, lay out all the goals. For individual matters, let's construct a hypothesis about what will happen if things work in an ideal manner. Or to put it another way, a somewhat more challenging way, to the advocate of a specific goals program. Imagine that I'm the investor in the project, and here is the array of possible results suggested for the initiative I have in mind. As the investor, I think a question I'm going to ask is, how am I going to know that it's working? That is, you want me to invest a lot of resources in your program. You've identified for me what you hope to achieve. How do I know it's working? What do I look at to identify success? I think one, and I do it without judgment. That is, I'm not being judgmental. In the words of Ted Lasso, I'm not being judgmental. I'm being curious. I'm just curious to know what to look for along the way as the program's unfolding. I think pushing an advocate of any goal structure, more austere, more elaborate, to identify metrics for assessment is an extremely useful exercise. And it puts you in a place to begin actually measuring outcomes. And even short of that, where you can get some agreement that different goals might collide or create friction among them, when those come up, to pose the question, what is the exchange rate between these goals? Where there is tension, how's the tension to be resolved? What value do I attach to one objective versus another one? And again, I think the aim is to unmask the kinds of choices that are being made in individual matters. I don't necessarily object to individual goal structures as such. I have a sense of which are harder to apply than others, but I have no moral certainty that says this goals framework is better than this one. And a nation, a democracy, legitimately can decide what those aims are. That's not my call; that's their call. Once that's done, what I expect from a system is a clear specification of what those aims are, a discussion of the methodology that's being applied in individual matters, a candid discussion of what weight was given to different factors in individual matters, and the revelation of a methodology, again, to get some sense of how it's working as we go along. Can computational antitrust provide a perfect framework for doing all of this? No. But I think that the interest that it has on measurement, on evaluation, has a healthy potential to push in the direction of spelling these kinds of assumptions out and making them transparent. And again, I ask for it without judgment. I simply ask for the point of view of an informative revelation of what's happening. In a sense, I have no view about what you should do. I have a strong view that you should explain to me what you've done. That, in the sense of a mathematics exam, show your work.
A lot of what we've been explaining over the years is that by having the willingness to indeed use more of computational tools, you will end up impacting the substance of what you do in antitrust, which is exactly the sense, it seems to me, of your answer, which is to say, you want to protect, environments, you want to achieve other objectives, well, maybe fine. But first of all, that brings a lot of interesting questions. First being, how do you measure that objective? So if we talk about the environment, is it just pollution, or do you also take the quality of water into consideration and so many, other sub-objectives that you may want to compute? Then the question is, can you get the data to assess whether or not the objective can ever be achieved? Because if you cannot, well, I'm not too comfortable with you trying to pursue that objective, because of course you always say, well, I achieved my objective. And if you can get the data, then can you publish the data so I can also see that you are not, finding a way to argue that indeed you reached that objective. So it's the tools, going back to the substance of what is antitrust, and of course the substance may also bring different kind of tools. And I believe Theodora may have a question dealing with that.
Yeah, for sure. So your discussion of goals showcases that antitrust is deeply underlined by frictions, tensions, and trade-offs. And this brings me back to something you talked about at the annual conference when you mentioned the AI Act and how it intervenes in an already very complex landscape where you have all these different regulations which impact competition and have important trade-offs which cannot be possibly analyzed ex ante. And then my question is, given how much the EU is regulating right now and how big of an impact this has and how unforeseeable all these actions are, don't you think that relying on more computational tools could actually be an alternative to rushing to regulate in the context of incomplete information and unforeseeability? Don't you think we could do more case-by-case analysis through computational tools rather than implement these broad ex-ante sweeping tools?
I think my mildest claim would be that the use of the computational tools would inform the formulation of the regulatory regime in a much more effective way than not using it. That is suppose there's an obvious political imperative to take some form of intervention, and in the form of regulation, a statute. I think the computational tools would discipline that process more than not using the tools. The tools, I think, have a great capacity to ask great questions, to force people to wrestle with difficult questions. And again, even if the analysis doesn't lend itself to a specific answer or a highly confident answer, I have a lot of confidence that the process of trying to answer the questions ensures that the mechanism chosen is much more effective. So I think it injects a degree of discipline into the process that makes the process more effective. And I realize an objection is, well, a lot of it's unmeasurable. You can't get the data; it's unmeasurable. Even at that level, if you could get the data, what would you like to look at? What would give me some way of anticipating the consequences of the measure that you have in mind? Engage almost in a dreamlike process of imagining what the world will look like if your program is applied perfectly. What can I look for? What sorts of things are going to happen? I'd like to see that, and I go back to the healthcare example. A physician that's recommending a type of treatment will tell you, look for this and this. After a certain period of time, your knee should feel better. You should feel less strain. The consequence of this intervention on the knee, it's going to be sore for this period of time. You take these tablets, it'll feel better. You'll be walking further. Here is the progression you can expect. Now maybe nothing so precise is possible in this area, but I very much like the discipline that it brings to bear on both identifying what the anticipated benefits are and attempting to construct a way of observing progress toward the accomplishment of those intended benefits. I get, as Thibaut was saying a moment ago, I'm discomforted by an approach that consists of saying what I'm doing is very important. it's very difficult to measure whether I'm doing it well, but I can assure you that I'm doing a good job. It sounds a lot like teaching in a university where faculty object to student assessments, but I don't have a lot of confidence in that approach to policy making.
Talking about imaginary words, which you just mentioned, leads me to two bonus questions that we want to ask. Something we want to introduce with this new format of the podcast. So I'll start with the first one, and then Teodora will be asking you the second one. If you were, again, at the head of an agency, trying to achieve the worst possible outcome, what would you do? And how does that inform what we should do in the opposite direction, meaning a imaginary word that is actually leading to the best possible outcome?
One destructive step I would take is to cancel all investments in assessment of effects. I would say our evaluation program consists of a confident assurance that whatever we're doing is good. In principle, it should be good. We're going to keep doing it. And that the evaluation of effects is a distraction. So I would spend nothing on evaluation beyond my own expression of certainty that it's working. A second thing I would do is to reduce investments in overhead related to analytical capability and knowledge building. I'd say I don't need to learn more about these sectors. I've got a set of principles that apply pretty broadly. They've worked well in the past, and they'll work well again. So build a data team. Why would I ever do that? Invest in doing market studies that make me smarter about the sector. That's a distraction. That's the equivalent of just talking about the fire while the fire burns the house down. So it's time to get the trucks out with the hoses and get to work instead of talking about asking the question, well, why do we have so many fires and how might they be prevented? Well, what's the most effective way of fighting a fire? To detecting it early. I'm not going to ask those kinds of questions. I'm going to wait for the alarm bell to ring. I get the trucks out and go to work. So two really destructive steps: no evaluation, no investment in building knowledge, and a third I'll toss in is make sure that when you arrive as a new leader, you just rubbish everything your predecessors have done. That is, you depict your agency as a failure, and you announce that this is a leper colony, but I'm here to cure it because I'm a great person. So that you stubbornly refuse to acknowledge that anything good happened before you arrived, which means this learning process we referred to at the top of the podcast, that we're not going to do that because there's nothing to learn from my predecessors other than that they did a bad job.
You know, I realize while asking the question that maybe some officials would actually recognize themselves in your answer, which I hope is not the case. But if it is, now you know what to do or not.
If I wanted to throw in a fourth to my hall of infamy, I'd simply say make sure that you claim credit for every good thing that happens and you don't share any credit with anyone else, least of all the professional staff.
Yeah.
So make sure that your tenure in office is all about you and not about anyone else. Be sure to claim credit at every opportunity and to shed blame every moment that you can.
That also reminds me of pretty much every elections in the world, right? Where the economy, if there is a problem, will be the fault of the guy or the woman before. And if the economy is doing well, it's only because of what you've done in terms of implementing policies and never because of the past.
Never.
So maybe lessons here for outside of antitrust. Teodora, I let you ask the final question.
Well, I can only hope that this was a description of a fictitious head of agency and no real person in the world will find themselves. And what
exactly, Teodora, only fiction, pure fiction.
Indeed. So I think Thibault's question was quite hard, but you did a great job at answering it. So I'm going to go ahead and ask an even more difficult one, I would dare say. So what would you think could drastically change the course of antitrust in the next decade? And this question is hard because it's about the future. And as you said, the future is very difficult to assess. We need lots of caution. So this is my invitation for you to be maybe a bit less cautious and try to dare to make an an assumption about how things will go?
A couple of things could change the world a lot. If we have a continuing drift in the direction of anti-globalization, strong measures to stifle trade, deep embrace protectionist impulses, the renationalization of markets in a way that relieves pressure from external supply sources. That will change, I think, pretty dramatically the way that competition policy operates. If we have desperately destructive regional conflicts, armed conflicts, we'll see a massive reallocation of expenditures over time back to the production of military hardware and services, and out of the development of other products and services that more directly benefit consumers. If we had, I guess on a more positive side, suppose that computational antitrust catches on, and suppose that we develop a better understanding of what we've done before, a better understanding of what it accomplished, a better understanding of what seems to work, what doesn't work so well but could be made better. I think we might gradually see an impressive improvement in the way in which policy develops that would have broad positive consequences across countries, so that if the initiative that brings us together here is successful, maybe in a slow and evolutionary way, we could come to see decades from now, and I think we're all long-distance runners in this respect, we'll see adjustments in policy and look back and say that was worth doing.
You know, what I like even in the negative side of your answer is that a lot of what you mentioned can actually be measured, right? So the renationalization of markets could be measured, also using computational tools. So maybe we should think about doing that, and indeed, putting some trigger warning when necessary. But on that, I think it's time to end the conversation. Bill, as always, we are so grateful for your time and your interest and effort in the field. So thank you so very much. Theodora, thank you so very much again for everything you've been doing. And to everyone out there, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.